If you're looking for visionary conversations that push the boundaries of everything you thought you knew, welcome to Conversations Beyond the Cutting Edge, where every month, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandy Sedgbeer invites two leading authorities from distinctly different fields to engage in a deep dialogue focusing on the latest discoveries, information, and insights on some of today's most provocative metaphysical topics. Here's your host, Sandy Sedgbeer.
Hello, and welcome to part 2 of this month's conversation Beyond the Cutting Edge with author, teacher, and consciousness researcher Penny Kelly and former church doctor, theological educator, and Anglican Archdeacon turned paleocontact researcher and best-selling author, Paul Anthony Wallis. Today's conversation is going to expand on some of the topics that we briefly touched on in episode 1. And we're also going to join up some dots between such seemingly disparate topics as the unexplored stories of Mary Magdalene, the real history of the Matriarchy, supernovas, planetary resets, and underground cities, humanity's move to its next level of being, and the importance of recognizing the guidance we're getting, and more. Penny Kelly, Paul Wallis, back to, it's really good to have you back on the show.
Hi,
Thanks,
Sandy.
Sandy.
Hi, Paul. It's
Good
good
day,
to
Penny.
be here. Yeah, and hello to everyone out there.
So let's start by taking a little trip back in time to discover what we don't know about Mary Magdalene, matriarchal societies, and the cancellation of the goddess Asherah from the Bible. What can these tell us about the true nature of reality and feminine wisdom? So I don't know which one of you wants to start first. I know, Penny, that you have a lot of knowledge about the matriarchy. Paul, I'm not sure of your knowledge in that area, but I know you know a lot about Asherah.
Yeah. Okay, I'll say a few things, but I'm really interested in Paul's perspective of Asherah. So that's always been like a kind of a mystery spot in many ways. So the history that I have studied, gone through, looked at, some of the archaeological studies and evidence indicates that for a very long time, quite a long time ago, there was the great goddess, the great mother. It was a time when God was thought of as a woman, and the earth was part of that. The earth was seen as part of that great mother. The earth was nurturing us, feeding us, providing us with everything that we needed. And the religion, the main religions, were of these goddesses. And that was gradually destroyed. I think the destruction began in Sumeria, and it trickled down. It became corrupt. The matriarchy became corrupt in the same way that today's patriarchy has become corrupt. And there began to be these movements, and then there was the whole complicating factor of what both Paul and I have written or talked about, which is there seems to have been some other people here, ET type people, and they were also a factor. And I have wondered, did they come out of the north? Because many of the ET groups that I know of came out of the far north because they were able to survive up there much better than people who were primitive and really tied to the land. So anyway, gradually the men's movement took over, began to really contest the matriarchy. But even in the time of, I'm not sure how you say it, Josephus, he wrote that men stayed home, took care of the children, did the gardening, did the weaving, took care of the house, and the women were the business women, the priestesses, they were the judges, they were the decision makers in society. And then gradually that started to change, and that may have persisted in pockets for a long time. The matriarchy may have persisted in pockets for a long time. And gradually, as the men's movement spread, the matriarchy died out. But there were some characteristics of the matriarchy that there's evidence of. One of the things that the matriarchy was very big on was sex, group sex in the fields, partly because they knew that a sexual experience could awaken Kundalini and cause an awakening of consciousness. And that became a sticking point. That's why Mary Magdalene was referred to as a whore, a woman of the night, a prostitute, because she was part of that lingering matriarchal belief. It really isn't just a belief. It's actually a factor in the awakening process. So here we are today. Mary Magdalene has been really sidelined in many ways, even though her gospel, the gospel of Mary Magdalene, very, very interesting. So I'll stop there. Paul, let's know what you have to say.
Can we just, in history, Asherah must come first, long before the matriarchy? Is that correct, Paul?
Yes, I think so. Julien Duy did some very interesting research following stories and associating them with what we know about ancient human migration patterns. And he used that as a way of dating story. And so if we want to use that approach to date the story of the divine feminine and of Asherah and her equivalent figures, so that's Hathor in Egypt, that's Astarte, that's Venus, that's Aphrodite. If we follow his method, then these stories of ancient visitations from female beings who gave us our primordial tuition in how to live in balance with the planet, which plants are good for food, which are good for medicines, which are good for higher consciousness, which are good to avoid, all that tutelage in how to move beyond living in animal subsistence is associated with these female entities. Those stories can be dated to between 175,000 years ago and prior. If we put that method to one side and just say, which are the earliest cultures that share these stories, then we're looking at the Aboriginal Australian cultures. Those date to at least 60,000 years ago. So by whatever measure you're taking, we're looking at a long, long time ago when our ancestors had a vivid memory of tuition from advanced female entities. And Asherah is the name given to that female tutelage in the Bible. Now, it's there in the text, but it's very easy to miss because the current version that we're reading of the Hebrew scriptures was put together by Yahwist scribes and high priests. And their message was all about Yahweh being the only God. Yahwist monotheism was what they wanted to teach. And of course, they can't just airbrush out the prior history when Judaism was actually a canon of paleocontact. It was a polytheistic canon. They can't airbrush it out. Everybody remembers it. And so instead, they have to put a spin on those old stories. And so when Jeremiah, for instance, the prophet says that on every high hill and under every green tree, Asherah would be honored. From every garrison city to every fortified town, there would be installations to Asherah. The writer has to add a little postscript to that. Isn't that awful? And now the reader feels they have to agree with the narrator's opinion. But if we go back to those texts, which you can find in Jeremiah and 2 Kings, for instance, and separate the narrator's opinion from the information the narrator's just given us, we realize that prior to the great reforms of the 8th to 6th century BCE, Judaism was full of Asherah. And in fact, archaeologically, the most commonly found religious artifact from the Levant are handheld figurines of Asherah that would be used at Asherah festivals, harvest festivals, where the Jewish people would give thanks to Asherah for this ancient help that she came and offered. And what's interesting about that process of cancellation, because we could call Asherah and Mary Magdalene early victims of cancel culture, what happened there is that kings came along who were Yahwists and who decided everyone in my kingdom should really worship my God, and we're going to get rid of all the others. And they got rid of them through the final rewrite of the Hebrew scriptures, you know, the addition of the "isn't that awful" into those texts, but also by disbanding the priesthoods that served Asherah and Chemosh and Milcom and all these other entities who had been remembered, and demolishing the temples that had been installed to commemorate them, and breaking the horns off the altars that were used in their festivals. And it really was quite a violent process of trying to eradicate this earlier memory. And what that did was it took the cultural memory from one that embraced a memory of female and male wisdom to one where the female wisdom was cut off. And when the writers had to explain how it was that the Jewish kings had paid for these priesthoods to Asherah, and it was Jewish kings who had had these temples built, even kings as wise as Solomon, they had to come up with an explanation of how that had happened. And so the explanation was, well, it was the wives. They were foreign, weren't they? It was the foreign wives who persuaded their wise husbands into these unwise courses of action. And the writers don't even feel they have to sell that story. Just a couple of lines is all they need. All they think they need to do is say, women, foreigners. And they expect the reader to say, oh, yeah, of course, yeah, well, that explains it. But of course, it doesn't explain it.
Yeah.
And it only explains it if you're already pretty prejudiced in those directions. Solomon was the wisest king in the Hebrew tradition, and he had these installations to Asherah. And yet, because King Hezekiah, King Josiah, High Priest Hilkiah, Royal Scribe Shaphan, Senior Priest Ezra had the upper hand in controlling the narrative when the scriptures were put into their present form, they were able to sort of set in stone the canon that would form Jewish worldview from that time to this. So that's how poor Asherah, aka Hathor, Venus, Aphrodite, Astarte, got airbrushed out of the picture. And then Christianity does something very similar with Mary Magdalene, who, when we look at the early kaleidoscope of Gospels and epistles, was a very significant part of the picture. It was Jesus and Mary, the teachers. It was Mary the Tower, not Mary the prostitute, Mary the Tower.
Right.
And the Gospel of Philip tells us that Mary was the one that Jesus would kiss frequently on the, and then that word has been scratched out. But I think we can fill in the blanks. And when they got rid of Mary Magdalene, again, not only was it a deletion of the female contribution, but it then distorts the image of Jesus, because now you've got this this unsexed celibate leader, and that's who we're following. And you've lost a whole load of texture and humanity if it was actually Jesus, the bloke who had a girl, or a married Jesus, or even a family. And you look
made
at
him
the
ordinary.
that's right. And they made him ordinary, made him relatable. And I think not only have you lost the woman, but you've lost the relationship, and you've lost the affection and the respect. You've lost the place for the feminine. You've lost the sexuality. Mary now becomes associated with sexuality in a negative way. So you're really distorting the whole picture. And in a way, it was perhaps a worse distortion than simply the loss of Asherah, but they're part of a big picture. So the masculinization of our image of God and of humanity had been going on for 800 years before the early Christian documents were written. And then you get into the 4th century of the Common Era, and the same process kicks in again as all the blokes take charge, because they're now running the Department of Religion for the Empire, of course. So that's a thumbnail sketch of how we went from a very rich understanding of living in balance with the planet, of embracing all the divine tuition that we'd received, to one where religion is a very masculinized affair and serving a purpose of control rather than empowerment.
I've read that Jesus tried to restore the sacred feminine and matriarchal societies.
Right.
That was, he put a lot of effort into trying to do that. And Penny, you talked last time about all the women that were around him.
Yeah.
That there were women there all the time, and particularly at the end.
I know. Yeah. Yeah, there's the women back in the days of the matriarchy were the only ones who could own land, and Mary Magdalene was quite well-to-do. And I think the women schooled in the ways of the matriarchy recognized that here's this man, Jesus of Nazareth, or whatever name you want to give to him. He awakened his consciousness in the way that we were all meant to awaken. And they were nurturing him and saying, speak up, you have to tell people about this. And Mary Magdalene supported his tours and travels. And I remember when I first heard that, thinking, oh, wow, here I thought all of the travels Jesus made and his tours and his speaking, I thought that was somehow just happened magically. It didn't need any organizing. It didn't have to be paid for. And all of a sudden, it became clear to me how much religion has taken us away from the everyday practicality of what's the day-to-day issue that each one of us deals with, or issues. And I have to add this one other thing. I had a very good friend who was a very close friend of Pope Francis. This fellow was a bishop from South America, actually grew up just a few miles south of me. And he was a bishop in the Catholic Church. And he said at one point, when we were talking about the matriarchy, we were talking about the celibacy, and did that make sense? And he said that was a reaction to the blatant sexual nature of the matriarchy, and that priests were told they could not be married. And I said, but why? And he said, so that the women could not get their hands on the land or the church properties. The whole goal of the church was to, I like your term, Paul, airbrush the women out, make sure that they could not get control of the land again. And that's where we're at today. And when I was growing up, women could not own property. You couldn't get a loan. You couldn't own a car. That was something that, happened when I was in my 30s. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm a valid member of society now. And that's not the way it was when I was growing up, or my mother and the previous generations. So
what does all this tell us about the true nature of reality?
You want to say something, Paul?
Yes, the true nature of reality is that women are very practical. And just as Penny was saying, I think in my early days as a believer assumed that Jesus's tours all happened magically, that he was able to travel with this cohort of people, find places to stay, get fed, find venues where they could have events, so on and so forth, where Jesus could speak, borrow boats so that Jesus could speak from them, for instance, all for free, all without any need for money. And it's only, of course, because we tend to read these stories with a religious/magical hat on. But of course, if you're traveling with a group of people and you have to feed them, that has always needed money. And I've got the little passage that Penny was referring to right in front of me, and I'll just read from it. It's from the Good News translation, lovely, simple, clear translation. It says this: "Sometime later, Jesus traveled through towns and villages, preaching the good news about the kingdom of God. The 12 disciples went with him." And I'll just add there, this actually suggests a larger crowd. When you read the detailed version of this summary, you realize there's a great crowd of people accompanying him, and that those who are traveling with him all have to be housed, fed, so on and so forth. So that's his travel through.
Wow.
The 12 disciples went with him, and so did some women who had been healed of evil spirits and diseases. Mary, who was called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had been driven out. Joanna, whose husband Chusa was an officer at Herod's court. And Susanna, and many other women who used their own resources to help Jesus and his disciples. So that's coming back to what Penny was saying, that at that time, women did have resources, they did have wealth, and it's the women here who are underwriting Jesus's public ministry. They are supporters of his ministry, they've benefited from it, and now they're going to see to the practical things to see that he and his team always have billets, always have food, are always looked after, are able to travel, so on and so forth. Yeah. And it's interesting to me that that little verse is there in the Gospels, somehow always forgotten. I was in church-based ministry for 33 years, and the only sermons I ever heard preaching on that little passage were the ones I preached. I'd never heard it anywhere else. And often when you talk in conversation with people in Bible study groups, I'd find people saying, "Isn't there a verse somewhere?" No one could ever remember where it was. But it is there. And again, it is honoring the female contribution to Jesus's ministry. There's a very similar passage in the New Testament at the end of the book of Romans, where the Apostle Paul is saying thank you to people who've helped him on his tours and in different parts of the world, and key leadership people. And it's a list full of women. So it was the later tradition of Christianity, really shaped by imperial religion, that airbrushes all that out. It's still there in Paul, it's still there in Jesus, that the female contribution was absolutely massive in terms of not just financing the ministry, but then enabling it. So you've got very significant female leaders, church planters, church elders in the New Testament. Again, verses that have been not airbrushed out, but somewhat overlooked as Christianity has taken this very patriarchal form that it has.
You know, I think the problem that we keep running into around this whole issue is people, this kind of goes back to your question, Sandy. What is the nature of reality? And how does the reality unfold, and how would it unfold if we were more in tune with it? I don't remember whose book it was in. It was either James Mellart or maybe Rianne Eisler, could have been Merlin Stone. But the comment was that when church people declared that it was absolutely punishable by death if you were caught doing anything with astrology, the stars, Mother Nature, anything like that, people's response was, but the world won't work correctly. The weather won't cooperate if we can't communicate with it. And of course, they didn't go any further than that, just, recorded that remark, that response to the church's declaration that astrology was punishable by death. And even looking up at the stars was not okay. And I think they knew at some level that there was some unfolding of the human consciousness that was meant to happen, built in. Women have always been more attuned to that, but they're not the only ones. Men wake up too. Men have Kundalini experiences just like women do. And there's a change in consciousness. And that when you have that change, you realize that reality is run, developed, unfolded by consciousness, and that we are full partners in that, with the earth, with the sun, the moon, with everything.
But there's another piece there. You're talking about astrology was banned, presumably astronomy too, looking up at the stars.
Right.
Now, in the section that we're going to talk about after we come back from the break on the cycles of cataclysm, we're talking about the cycles of the planets there and their impact on humanity and what the government knows that we don't know about that. So there is, we're joining some dots there between where we've come and where we'll be going after the break.
I was just going to say that consulting female wisdom, the rules are different for the general public to the elites, of course. So kings could consult with wise women and astrologers and mediums and traditional healers. And apparently that was okay. This is all through the ages. But if those services are offered to the general public, well, that's when you've probably got an execution down the line. Yeah. And you can see this in different cultures all around the world, but it was certainly the case in British history that kings and queens would expect to be able to consult their astrologers. But if those astrologers were advising, the enemies of the crown or the general public, then it's a totally different story. And so that relates to what you were just saying, Sandy, about the division of information from one group of society to the next.
And isn't it interesting that all the oracles are usually female?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. We've got to take a break now. You're listening to Conversations Beyond the Cutting Edge. I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, and my guest this month, the writer, author, teacher, and consciousness researcher Penny Kelly, and former church doctor, theological educator, and Archdeacon turned paleocontact researcher and author Paul Anthony Wallis. Still to come, why are we here? What choices await us? And how can we turn things around and evolve to the next level of being? We'll be back with more in a few moments.
Times TV.
Maya Angelou once said that there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, and when I'm not hosting Times Media's flagship radio show What Is Going On and the No BS Spiritual Book Club, I help people share their untold stories. Books are my life, my joy and my passion, and there is no greater reward than helping aspiring writers get their books out of their heads and into the hands of those who are waiting to read them. If you feel that you have a book in you but don't know where to begin, visit sedgbeer.com, click on the Work With Me tab and find out how my experience helping others tell their stories might be just what you've been looking for. That's sedgbeer.com, sedgbeer.com.
Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. Times Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, Om Times offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an Om Times magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on Om Times TV and broadcasting it across the extensive Om Times radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. Om Times. Open yourself to the possibilities.
Everything that we do, we can do in a contemplative manner. Through the art of contemplation, you can use the gene keys in a really powerful way. Gene keys is basically the code book of life. In the gene keys, the book is made up of these three levels: shadows, gifts, and cities. And the journey is through those three levels, kind of unpicking of the shadow states, the releasing of the gifts, and then the embodying of this higher consciousness called the city. And the cities are very exalted words. And it's not like we kind of suddenly are all these exalted Christ-like beings, but we have flashes and illuminations along the journey. And the more we get stuck into the journey, the more illumination comes to us, because the more we're releasing the light from in these codes inside our DNA. So all those revelations are inside us. So the contemplative way is the inner way.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back. So in the last episode, we briefly touched on the cycles of cataclysm, what the government know that we don't know about the cycles of the planets, cataclysms, and their impact on humanity. And you said that their info came from Chan Thomas's book about Adam and Eve, which tells a different story about human origins. So can both of you speak to this? Because I want to find out, why is it that we can always come back to the planets in these things? And why are we always being moved away from that, told that we shouldn't be exploring those things? I mean, astrology has been, laughed at for centuries, but once upon a time, it was highly, highly regarded, right along there with astronomy.
Yeah, you're right, Sandy. And I think that question about what is that connection to the planet, we're part of that planet. We are the development of the higher consciousness of planet Earth. And she supports all kinds of beings, creatures, 2-legged, 4-legged, 8-legged, winged, you name it, finned. And we humans have had this opportunity to have this amazing consciousness. And the way the human is designed is to unfold that consciousness to become the gods of the future. And when I say that, I'm not talking about the kind of immature, silly, childish God that most people imagine. I'm talking about the kind of individual who has full awareness of self, who knows what consciousness is and is using it in ways that make the world a better place, and is committed to that kind of action, which then changes what I'm going to call the frequency. If you've ever had your brain waves tested and you get to see what your brain is doing, it's it's an awakening all of its own. But when you move up into, say, the higher levels of consciousness, you have access to a whole different range and quality of information. And that's where I think we need to go. And that results in a shift into fourth dimensional existence, or even fifth, then nobody's pushing you to do it. You have to decide that you're going to shift your consciousness and you're going to respond in certain ways, and then you will be tested, typically, to see if you can hold it. And when you can hold it, you get the next step. So here we are, discovering all of these things that the governments have hidden. And turns out that there are cycles in the planet. And these cycles are repetitive, about every 12, 13,000 years. And they're devastating cycles. And so each civilization has about 12,000 years to get their bricks in a pile and get off the planet. Or learn to get off the planet. And otherwise they self-destruct. So we're right at that edge right now.
So Paul, last time you talked about why we're here. And we're here with a purpose. We're here with an assignment, many of us. What is that purpose? What is that assignment?
Well, I'll go back to what Penny was saying just now about understanding the planet as an organism and as a conscious organism. Plato taught about this 2,500 years ago, and he puts it in the words of one of the incidental characters in, I think it's his book Phaedo, or it might be Timaeus and Critias. And he just says it in passing, but the idea is put out there that we best understand ourselves when we understand ourselves to be part of this conscious organism called Earth. And so part of what he thinks we need to do is wake up to that and to live in balance with our planet and to live in communication with our planet. But it's part of a great cosmic picture that Plato has when he talks about where everything came from, the origins of the cosmos. He talks about the unified field of consciousness. And he argues in a brilliant way, in a very scientific, logical way, that consciousness had to come before the material, and that the material cosmos exists in order for the primordial consciousness to express and experience itself. And I liken it to, if you watch what happens when a little bird wakes up in the morning, it will stretch one wing, it'll stretch another wing, it'll stretch one leg, stretch the other leg, and then it'll breathe and start singing. And it's as if when the primordial field of consciousness does that, what happens is the material cosmos. That is how consciousness expresses itself. And then Plato finds his way to a certain sense of a meaning of life for all of us that comes from this explanation of origins. In the beginning, consciousness is all together. It's in a state of harmony, equilibrium. And Plato says if we want to translate that into material experiential terms, then we're talking about harmony, goodness, love. And so now that consciousness is a material cosmos of all kinds of phenomena, it poses a question. Can we do consciousness, intelligence, order, harmony, love as a universe of individual entities exercising freedom? Can we do it that way? And everything that answers yes to that question, we might call good. And everything that answers no to that question, and there's plenty that answers no, we would call bad. And that's where Plato gets sort of a foundation for a moral vision. But he also then goes on from there to talk about how we live our lives. And again, arguing from logic, but then also arguing from transpersonal experiences. He says that you and I will have a better human experience if we can learn to shake off everything that answers no to that question. And very often those are the heavier emotions, as he calls them. So things like fury, anger, rage, resentment, unforgiveness, selfish ambition, all these things, he says, spoils our individual experience and our corporate experience. And we will learn to have a better experience and be wiser if we can work out how to shake those things off and live according to higher emotions like creativity and compassion and love. And that's our individual purpose, which all boils down to we're here to learn love. But it's actually part of a cosmic experience where the cosmos is asking these questions and the cosmos is trying to find equilibrium. And I just love how Plato ties all that together. And so with that as a background, we're here to become more conscious, more aware, more intelligent, more loving, more harmonious. And we're here to learn how to do that individually, as families, towns, societies, solar systems, galaxies.
Right.
It applies on every plane that you can look.
And yet, if this is a kind of prime directive for humans, yeah. At the same time, last time you talked about governments seemingly, I think, taking advantage of these cyclical periods of time. You talked about survival projects taking place, like building underground tunnels and cities, stocking them with supplies, reducing populations. So why is it that we have this constant push me, pull you thing? If our prime directive is to evolve, and move more to love, why is there always something pushing us back?
Well, I think the Star Trek canon gives us a great answer to that question, because there are two models of harmony and order that are presented by that story, especially when you get into the next generation, the Jean-Luc Picard Star Treks, because there you've got the United Federation of Planets, which is this lovely vision of all kinds of different species working out how to live in the universe together in harmony and respecting each other's differences. And it's a wonderful picture of diversity and inclusion and harmony. And then you've got the Borg. And the Borg come along, and their idea of harmony is control, where they will delete everyone's differences so they can all be managed by the hive mind. And the reason that story is so resonant is that we experience that in our history, in our life as human beings, that very often the elites who run things, their agenda is control and management. And so there's a tendency in the Borg direction, whereas the grassroots really want to be left alone and live happy, harmonious lives. And we're in the direction of the United Federation of Planets. And the reason there's this push me, pull you is because of these lower emotions. So the elites who have power want to keep power. They fear losing power. The elites who have resources to protect themselves from the fearful things that might come, well, they will put resources into protecting themselves, hence the underground bunkers, hence the military intelligence projects, all reading Chan Thomas's book, working out, well, what do we need to do in order to keep government going? I think it boils down to that fear of non-existence and how the elites who run things respond to that fear, and then how the rest of us might respond to it, which might be something quite different.
Do you think, Paul, that they ever think of what happens to them, or who are they going to control if there's no people left to control?
Yes.
Yes, I think they probably do. And probably when the elites have these conversations, there's a certain number of human beings they think will be ideal in terms of keeping them resourced but being manageable. So I think they probably ticked that box, Penny.
Okay.
You know, as the story keeps going, as you told us last time, Penny, you know, there's been so many points in humanity's history where they have reached this place, this point of evolution and self-destructed.
Right.
So, you know, all of these Borgs, if you like, trying to take control, you know, they must know that. That's a cycle too.
They do, but they don't apply it to themselves. They have themselves in a different category. And I would say also where I come from, if you can't take care, if you, meaning the civilization existing on a given planet, if they don't learn to develop the technology, high-powered technology, and use it wisely for the betterment of all mankind, and take care of the planet and stop trashing it, then you don't deserve to get off the planet, and they will interfere with development, and that becomes part of the test. Are you ready for fourth dimensional living, fifth dimensional living, or higher? And for us right now, I don't know what to say. It doesn't look good. So
It's a mixed picture.
Yeah, it's a mixed picture. Yes, it is. And I, for one, am like, no, we can do this. We can do this. You just have to shift your consciousness. But people are not used to hearing anything about consciousness. And they are really, they're even, they're even more, I'm going to say, skeptical when it comes to adding in that there's people other than humans, the earthling humans, that are watching and listening and interfering at some points and trying to help at other points. So we're kind of in this stalled out, arrested development is what I call it, kind of place. And we need to reverse that like pronto.
So we have an opportunity to break that cycle and move into a higher consciousness. And you've put together a PowerPoint that demonstrates how the third, fourth, and fifth dimensions of consciousness act and think and behave,
right,
and respond. How do we get to the next level?
So I think the best way, the only way that I know, and this comes from 45 years worth of teaching. Okay, after Kundalini, I started teaching, and mostly because I just needed somebody else to talk about this stuff with. But I've learned a lot along the way. First, you have to understand how the human body, brain, the central nervous system, the whole thing is meant to work. And we're not really taught that. We're taught about these disconnected parts and pieces. So I put all that back together in, my intuition classes have been really quite successful in getting people to adopt that part of themselves that they have been cut off from. And some people do break down and cry when they have, we do these tests all the time. Okay, look at this. What do you see? And they get it. And it's a telepathic exercise and they start crying. It's like, oh my gosh, what? I didn't know I could do that. Oh my, I did it. Oh my. And so there's this big shock. And when people begin to wake up, you begin to let go of the old ideas just enough to allow you to integrate the truth and then pull back what's still valuable from that old information, or it takes on a new angle of understanding. And you begin to say, oh, I get it. And you begin to use your clairvoyance and your clairsentience and your, clairaudience and clairgustance, which is the ability to look at a plant and know what it's going to taste like or what it's going to do in the body without putting it in your mouth. And so those are some of the gifts. And we have 26 senses. Most people only think we have 5. And so you start learning about how you're built and how you're meant to operate. At the same time, you're having some teacher standing up there saying, okay, do this, clear your mind, put your attention there. And they do it and then go, OMG. And so what happens is little by little, you move people toward cooperation, toward a sense of, okay, let's take care of the vehicle, which is the body, because the better condition that's in, the better all those gifts and abilities work. And then you just keep on moving them toward what I call the Christ state or the Buddha state, which is you step into your power. And that, it's a process, but it can be done in a year. It's not a quick thing. You have to be willing to kind of stand up a little, but it can be done.
Paul, you say that it's really important that we recognize the guidance that we're getting and listen to our guides and our intuition. But with all kinds of beings surrounding us, having their own kinds of influences on us, how can we discern those that are helpful, the guidance that's helpful, from that, which is harmful?
Yes, that's a great question. When I look at the New Testament, I find a really interesting passage in 1 John 4. So this is giving us a window into the expected experience of the primitive Christians. The writer of 1 John 4 is fully expecting believers to have close encounter experiences with beings he calls spirits. And he never defines what he means by spirits. We hear that word in English and we think, oh, this is some kind of a disembodied, maybe energy-based spiritual being. Doesn't necessarily mean that at all. In ancient cultures, a spirit was simply someone who turns up and you don't know how they got there. And then they disappear and you don't know how they disappeared. That's a spirit. So they can be physical, they can be energy-based, they can be interdimensional. The writer never explains what these spirits are, but says you're going to get some good information from them, but some of them are going to deceive you as well. And so the writer says, if any spirit turns up and trash talks Jesus, don't pay any attention to that one. And so undergirding that little piece of advice is the writer's understanding that it's up to us to decide if we've had an encounter, if we think we've received some information. It's up to us to decide, do I think that's true? Do I think that's helpful? Do I need to do anything about that? And when you look at the teachings of Jesus, for instance, in the Gospels, when he talks about navigating our way through life, he always appeals to our intelligence. So that if we've got some heavier emotion that's going to drive us in an unhelpful direction, rage, anger, fury, unforgiveness, selfish ambition, all that sort of thing, what Jesus usually does is he appeals to our intelligence to think through the consequences before we make any decisions. He's clearly very confident that we can do that and make moral decisions based on that kind of calculation. And I think the writer of 1 John 4 is doing exactly the same. When he says, weigh up, do you think it's true? Is it helpful? Do I need to do anything about it? He fully expects us to be able to do that, largely in the same way Jesus did, by thinking about consequences. So I think we do ourselves an injustice when we say that discerning evil from good is really too hard for us. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. Children can do it. We teach our children to do it. We do have the capacity to discern. And if we're not sure about something, then we don't have to do anything about it. I think it really is that simple. And the writer seems to believe that if we're willing to play our part and be the sovereign being, it means that we will be able to play with, respond to all kinds of information that's going to come our way. It's there in Christianity, but it's also there in the indigenous culture of people who live all around the world. And if you go to a traditional healer in many parts of the world, what they will expect to do is tune in to your invisible cloud of guides and what they're saying, and then derive some kind of information about you that will help them find a treatment plan for you, whether it's for a physical thing or a life decision, so on and so forth. But their worldview is that each one of us comes with a cloud of helpers, giving communication intended to support our progress through life. And I find that very, very empowering, whereas I think often certainly in Christian circles, we're taught to be very afraid of hearing voices or following our intuition. We're taught to distrust everything that might come from our gut or our heart or our instincts, because
I'm going to have
we're
to
fallen
interrupt you there,
beings.
Paul. I am so sorry, but we are getting very close to the end of our hour. And as always, we haven't
Alrighty.
covered half of what we wanted to. But one thing I will say to our viewers is that if you read Penny's books, particularly her latest one, The Revival, Path to a New Earth, New Human, you'll find it enormously helpful. And if you want a lot more information about all the things we've been discussing, read Paul's Eden series. I'm not going to pick on one particular title because they are all good and they all tell an incredible story about, humanity, our origins, everything that you could want to know that we haven't been able to say tonight. So thank you both for joining me for these 2 episodes. I wish we had 6. There's so much to get through, but thank you.
Thanks, Sandy. Thanks,
Oh,
Penny.
well. Yeah, thank you, Paul. Thank you for having us, Sandy.
Yeah, so for more information about Penny's work, you can visit her website, pennykelly.com, and you can learn more about everything that Paul's doing, his books, courses, videos, healing and coaching services at paulanthonywallis.com. I'm Sandy Sedgbeer. That's it for this week. We'll be back again in 2 weeks' time with another conversation beyond the cutting edge. Till then, it's goodbye from me, and thank you again to Paul Wallis and Penny Kelly.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.